Video game franchises are common. In fact, with modern game development, they sometimes won't even take on a new IP unless it has sequel potential. So it's not uncommon to fall in love with a series. However, don't get too attached, as we're about to learn how easy it is for them to die through this top 10 video games that killed their franchise. It's definitely still too early to definitely say Duke Nukem series is dead, but if it is, we can probably lay the blame at the feet of Duke Nukem Forever. Due to a long development time and numerous delays, Duke Nukem Forever had all but become a running joke when it was finally released, 14 years after its initial announcement. And, after all that, reception to the game was less than stellar. It was roundly criticised for its controls, humour, design and lack of polish. Some fans loved it, but it stands out as a shining example of a long-awaited game that fell far short of its hype. Its development time is the most likely culprit, especially when it comes to aspects players found outdated. There have been suggestions that a new game in this series will be made after all, and that may determine Duke Nukem's ultimate fate. Breath of Fire was going strong until the release of the 5th game in the series, Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter. It wasn't necessarily a bad game, but it was radically different from its predecessor. A sci-fi setting, a new battle system, and a story that required multiple playthroughs. It wasn't the Breath of Fire fans expected, and it divided the fanbase. After that, Breath of Fire stopped. After years of silence, Capcom finally unveiled a new game in the series, but the PC and mobile only Breath of Fire 6 looks nothing like the classic RPGs the originals were, and chances seem good we won't see another Breath of Fire game on console for a very long time. The Spyro series is a particularly strange example. It didn't die so much as evolve into something that has almost no ties to the original game, and it's hard to say which game exactly did it. Spyro, A Hero's Tale was the 5th game for consoles and 9th overall. It got mixed reviews following the similarly mediocre reception to Spyro Enter the Dragonfly. When the game Spyro Shadow Legacy also got poor reviews, that could have doomed the series. Instead, it was rebooted with the Legend of Spyro trilogy. The Legend of Spyro had its own continuity and plot, as well as gameplay more focused on action than platforming. Ultimately, this new take on Spyro also had mixed reception. However, Activision took one last chance with Spyro by taking the series in a completely different direction, and Skylanders Spyro's Adventure spawned the insanely popular Skylanders franchise. The core Spyro series may be dead, but at least it left behind something new. The side-scrolling Klonoa series was fairly popular, with several games released, even if a few never made it out of Japan. When the original game, Klonoa Daughter Phantomile, was remade for the Wii, everything seemed right for Klonoa to rise again. The remake, simply called Klonoa, got positive reviews, and terrible sales. That makes it especially disappointing. The Klonoa remake shouldn't have killed its franchise. It wasn't a bad game, it just didn't sell. And that killed any rumours of a Klonoa 2 remake following the first. The series lived on for a while through a webcomic, but that ended when the studio was shut down. No one has heard anything about Klonoa since then, and further sequels seem unlikely. The Command & Conquer series has been around since the early days of the RTS genre and became very popular, with multiple series that all delivered the gameplay its fans loved. Yet something went terribly wrong with the 4th game in the Tiberian series. Tiberian Twilight decided to change the gameplay by removing the resource gathering and base building. It also used DRM that required players to always be online. Finally, the single-player campaign was short and unimpressive, with most of the emphasis put on the multiplayer instead. Now the series is dead, unless you count Command & Conquer Tiberian Alliances, a real-time strategy MMO launched in 2012. Crash Bandicoot was one of the most beloved platforming series of the PlayStation 1 era, but after that, it suffered from changing developers repeatedly. The originals were made by Naughty Dog, the next two went to Traveller's Tales, Vicarious Visions made a few, and it eventually ended up in the hands of Radical Entertainment. As the developers tried new ideas, the series slowly lost its identity until it finally resulted in Crash: Mind Over Mutant. As a mission-based beat-em-up game, it strayed pretty far away from the original Crash formula. Many players considered it uninspired, and fans of the original games found it disappointing. It may not have been the worst received in the series, but it didn't sell well. After that, there were a few mobile Crash spin-offs, but even the last of those was released in 2010. Fans still hope for Crash Bandicoot's revival, and a few hints show some promise, but if it returns, most hope Naughty Dog is back at the helm. Capcom's Dino Crisis series is one of the saddest tales of a franchise's downfall, and it only lasted 3 games and 1 spin-off. The first Dino Crisis was survival horror, more or less Resident Evil, with dinosaurs instead of zombies. Dino Crisis 2 abandoned that style for action-adventure gameplay, but it was still an excellent game. And the light gun shooter Dino Stalker might have had mixed reviews, but it was only a spin-off anyway. Then, Dino Crisis 3 happened. Instead of continuing the story established in the first 2 games, Dino Crisis 3 adopted a futuristic setting and took place on a space station. The enemies weren't real dinosaurs, but even so, fighting dinosaurs in space sounds like a cool idea, except for an ill-conceived jetpack system that worked together with a camera to make the players' lives misery. Dino Crisis 3 came out in 2003, and the series has yet to be mentioned again. Due to Capcom's dubious handlings of the Resident Evil in recent years, maybe that's for the best. At first glance, it might appear there are many games in the Luna series, but there are actually only 4: Luna the Silver Star, Luna Eternal Blue, Luna Walking School, which was never released outside of Japan in any form, and Luna Dragon Song. All the others are remakes. So when Dragon Song came out in 2005, it had been a decade since the last new Luna story. Unfortunately, while the story was fine, it wasn't a good game. Your HP would decrease everywhere, even in towns. You couldn't get experience and items from the same battles. It had breakable items. Players felt it was tedious, convoluted, and highly flawed. Luna Dragon Song got poor reviews and sales, and other than 2 more remakes of the first game, the Luna series has been dead ever since. For most of these games, the idea that they killed the franchise comes through speculation since it was the last game in the series ever released. Who knows, maybe they didn't kill it after all. With Medal of Honor Warfighter, however, there is no doubt. Medal of Honor was a popular first-person shooter series set during World War II until the 13th game, which rebooted the series and placed it in modern times. Warfighter was its sequel, and it did terribly. Bugs, generic gameplay, and a bland plot, Warfighter made players wonder if Medal of Honor could ever overcome this. As it turns out, it couldn't. Because of the poor reception, EA put the series on hold indefinitely. Yes, Medal of Honor Warfighter officially killed its franchise. So what could be worse than the company acknowledging that the game killed its franchise? With Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts, it feels like they knew it before the game even came out. Nuts and Bolts wasn't a bad game. If it were a spin-off or released as a new IP, it wouldn't receive nearly the ire it does. Unfortunately, it wasn't a spin-off or a new IP. It was a Banjo-Kazooie game, the first in 8 years that was part of the main series. This was supposed to be the Banjo 3 fans had hoped for. But while Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie were traditional 3D platformers and collectathons, Nuts and Bolts dropped the vast majority of its predecessor's gameplay, along with Banjo and Kazooie's special abilities, to focus on vehicle building. You collect blueprints and materials to fashion a variety of vehicles which are used within various worlds. It was an enjoyable vehicle game, and the series' sense of humour remained intact, but the radically different gameplay, along with a few jokes about how the old gameplay was outdated, left fans angry. Rare hasn't made another Banjo-Kazooie since then. It hasn't made any 3D platformers since then. It's as if the entire company lost part of its identity with Nuts and Bolts. But worst of all, Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts predicted its own death. In the final cutscene, Kazooie asks Log, the Lord of Games, "Can I have my old abilities back? If this game isn't successful, we might need them for the next one." Log replies, "Good point, although you may never get another game." Any game can kill a franchise, but it takes a special sort of game to know it's franchise killer. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this week's list, and if you did, leave a like, and if you want to see more of these in the future, subscribe. And if you want to see more now, click here for my top 10 scariest moments in non-horror games, or here for my top 10 most influential 90s horror games.